The water pressure gauge on Marcus Webb's spring house dropped to zero at 11:43 a.m. on a Tuesday in June. For 3 months, the 42-year-old hydrogeologist had watched his century-old natural spring, the same spring his grandfather had protected, the same spring that provided crystal-clear water to his 10-acre homestead, slowly decline. First, it was subtle, a weaker flow from the main line. Then his irrigation system sputtered. Then his livestock tanks took twice as long to fill. But today, standing in the stone spring house his grandfather built in 1952, Marcus stared at gauges reading zero and felt something cold settle in his chest. This wasn't drought. This wasn't natural. Someone was stealing his water. And when he followed the pressure test results to the unauthorized PVC pipe junction buried 3 feet down at his property line, Marcus discovered something that made his engineering mind shift into a very different mode. The Meadowbrook Hills HOA had illegally tapped his spring. But what they didn't know was that the exhausted scientist they'd been stealing from had spent 15 years mapping underground water systems for a living. And he was about to teach them a very expensive lesson about aquifer rights. Before we see exactly how Marcus turned the tables on an entire HOA board that thought they could steal from a water rights expert. If you love stories where entitled people finally meet someone who knows exactly how to beat them at their own game, hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you'll want to see how this unfolds. This is a story in 3 parts. The violation that pushed a scientist past his breaking point, the confrontation where knowledge became power, and the resolution where an entire community learned that water rights are not suggestions. Marcus had moved to his family's rural property seeking peace after a difficult divorce. The spring wasn't just water to him. It was legacy, history, the reason his grandfather had chosen this land. For months, he endured the slow theft, watching his animals struggle, his garden wither, his family's heritage literally drain away. He tried reasoning with the HOA. He tried involving local authorities. Every door closed in his face. Every official told him proof was too hard to establish. Every day, the gauge dropped lower. But Marcus wasn't just any homeowner. He held a PhD in hydrogeology and specialized in underground water mapping. And the moment he confirmed that illegal tap, something fundamental shifted in him. They had picked the absolute wrong person to steal from. The confrontation didn't happen in a courtroom or at an HOA meeting. It happened in a county land office, in a lawyer's conference room, in surveyors' reports and mineral rights documents that Marcus had spent 2 decades learning to read. When he walked into that emergency HOA meeting with a folder 3 inches thick, the board president's smug expression lasted exactly as long as it took Marcus to lay out the first geological survey map. What the HOA discovered in that meeting was that their illegal tap wasn't just stealing from Marcus's property. They'd tapped directly into an aquifer that Marcus, through inheritance law and mineral rights statutes they'd never bothered to research, actually owned. Not just the spring, the entire underground water source. And Marcus had spent the last 3 weeks purchasing the surrounding aquifer rights from neighbors who were happy to sell to someone who actually understood water law. The resolution came in stages, each one more devastating to the HOA than the last. First, the cease and desist order backed by aquifer ownership documents that were irrefutable. Then the lawsuit for theft of natural resources. Then the engineering report showing exactly how much water they'd stolen, calculated down to the gallon, priced at commercial water rates. But the final twist, the moment that made Marcus smile for the first time in months, came when the HOA realized that shutting off their illegal tap meant 43 homes suddenly had no water supply at all. Because in their rush to save money by stealing from a quiet neighbor, they'd never properly connected to the county water system. And now they'd have to pay for it themselves, every pipe, every connection fee. every penalty for the illegal system they'd built. Here's exactly how it happened. Marcus Webb had returned to the family homestead outside Fredericksburg, Texas, on a February morning that felt like starting over. At 42, the hydrogeologist was rebuilding after a divorce that had cost him nearly everything except his career and his grandfather's land. The 10 acres sat in the hill country, remote enough for peace, but close enough to Austin for consulting work. The property's crown jewel was the spring, a natural artesian source that had flowed continuously since before Texas was a state. Marcus's grandfather, Howard Webb, had built the stone spring house in 1952, installing pressure systems and filtration that were decades ahead of their time. The old man had been a water engineer for the Army Corps, and he'd understood something fundamental. Water was wealth, water was power, and water rights were sacred. Marcus had grown up spending summers here, learning to read pressure gauges before he could drive, understanding aquifer dynamics before he'd taken his first geology course. Now, living in his grandfather's renovated farmhouse with 3 rescue horses, a small cattle herd, and an organic garden he'd planted as therapy, Marcus had thought he'd found sanctuary. The first incident happened in mid-March, subtle enough that Marcus almost missed it. He was filling the livestock tank on a Wednesday afternoon when he noticed the flow seemed weaker than usual. The spring typically pushed 15 gallons per minute, steady as a heartbeat. But that day, it felt closer to 12. Marcus checked the filtration system, found nothing wrong, and attributed it to seasonal variation. 2 weeks later, his irrigation system for the garden sputtered and failed during a watering cycle. When he investigated, the pressure gauge at the spring house read 11 gallons per minute. That was when Marcus's professional instincts activated. Natural springs didn't lose pressure this quickly without external factors. He spent a weekend running tests, checking for underground shifts or drought conditions. But rainfall had been normal. The aquifer should have been stable. Something else was happening. By early May, the situation had escalated beyond concerning into alarming. The spring flow had dropped to 8 gallons per minute. Marcus's horses were waiting longer at their automatic waterers. His garden, which had been thriving, showed stress from inconsistent irrigation. His cattle tank took hours to fill instead of 45 minutes. Worst of all, during a particularly dry week, the flow dropped to 5 gallons per minute, and Marcus watched 70 years of his grandfather's legacy system struggle to maintain household pressure. The engineer in him knew this wasn't natural. The grandson in him felt something precious slipping away. That's when Marcus noticed something during a property line inspection that made his blood run cold. Fresh earth disturbance along the eastern boundary. Not much, just a section about 6 feet long where the ground had been dug up and poorly reseeded. The grass was a different shade, the soil compaction wrong. Someone had been digging on his property line. Marcus spent the next week conducting a pressure test using tracer dyes and flow monitoring that would have cost a commercial client $15,000. What he discovered made him stand in the spring house for a full minute, just staring at the data. Someone had installed a tap junction underground, intercepting his spring's flow before it reached his systems. The theft was sophisticated, not something a casual trespasser could accomplish. This required planning, equipment, and knowledge of where his water lines ran. When Marcus excavated carefully along the eastern property line at 2 a.m. with a headlamp and a shovel, he found it. A PVC junction box, professionally installed, splitting his spring flow 60-40. 60% to the thief, 40% to him. His hands shook as he photographed the setup, documenting every angle, every connection point, every manufacturer label on the components. Then he followed the outflow pipe with a metal detector and ground-penetrating radar unit he'd borrowed from work. The unauthorized line ran directly into Meadowbrook Hills, the HOA community that had been built 5 years ago on former ranch land adjacent to his property. Marcus's first call was to the Gillespie County Sheriff's Office on a Thursday morning. The deputy who arrived, a young man named Torres, listened patiently, examined the photos, and then delivered the words Marcus had dreaded. "This is really a civil matter, Mr. Webb. Property disputes and water rights, that's between you and them. You'll need to lawyer up." Marcus tried the county water authority next. The bureaucrat on the phone was sympathetic but useless. Without proof of HOA involvement and without measuring actual water theft volume, we can't really intervene. Have you tried talking to their board? When Marcus called the Meadowbrook Hills HOA president, a woman named Patricia Kendrick, her response was stunning in its dismissal. "Mr. Webb, Meadowbrook Hills has a fully permitted water system. I don't know what you think you found, but we have nothing to do with your spring. Perhaps your system is just old and failing. Have you considered updating your infrastructure?" The patronizing tone, the immediate denial, the subtle insult about his grandfather's engineering, something snapped. Marcus sat in his grandfather's old office that evening, surrounded by 70 years of water surveys, property deeds, and mineral rights documents the old man had meticulously maintained. Howard Webb had taught Marcus a fundamental truth. Water law was complicated, often counterintuitive, and heavily favored whoever understood it best. The younger Webb had spent 15 years as a hydrogeologist, mapping aquifer systems for commercial and agricultural clients, testifying as an expert witness in water rights cases, and consulting on environmental impact assessments. He had professional relationships with land surveyors, water attorneys, and geological testing firms across 3 states. And as he sat there, looking at the gauge readings that showed his spring still hemorrhaging water to thieves, Marcus made a decision. He wasn't going to fight this through normal channels. Normal channels protected people like Patricia Kendrick, who smiled while stealing from their neighbors. No, Marcus was going to do something different. He was going to buy the aquifer, the entire underground water source that fed his spring. And then he was going to show the Meadowbrook Hills HOA exactly what happened when you stole from someone who understood water rights better than anyone in the county. If they wanted to play games with his family's legacy, Marcus would show them what games really looked like. And on Monday morning, he made the first call to his attorney. The trap didn't spring with dramatic confrontation. It sprung with paperwork filed on a humid Monday morning in the Gillespie County Land Office. Marcus had spent 3 weeks working with an attorney who specialized in mineral and water rights, a sharp woman named Elena Vasquez who'd actually smiled when Marcus explained what he wanted to do. "You understand this is going to be expensive and complicated," she'd warned. Marcus had smiled back. "I understand that my spring is currently running at 38% capacity because someone installed an illegal tap. I also understand that I'm about to become very motivated." What Elena and Marcus did over those 3 weeks was something the HOA board would never have imagined possible. They mapped the aquifer ownership. In Texas, water rights are Byzantine and often separated from surface land rights. Aquifer access, particularly for significant underground water sources, can be owned independently through mineral rights clauses that date back to Spanish land grants. Marcus's property sat atop what geological surveys confirmed was a significant aquifer formation, not massive enough for commercial exploitation, but substantial enough to supply hundreds of homes. His grandfather's original land patent from 1949 included specific language about mineral and water rights that Howard Webb, in his Army Corps wisdom, had insisted upon. Marcus owned not just the spring, but rights to the aquifer beneath his land. But here's where it got interesting. The aquifer extended beneath 6 other properties surrounding his land, including 2 parcels that bordered Meadowbrook Hills. And those property owners, all of them older families who'd held their land for generations, had never thought much about their aquifer rights because they used county water. When Marcus approached them with an offer to purchase those specific rights, explaining that he was protecting the aquifer from unauthorized use and would pay fair market value, every single one agreed. Within 2 weeks, Marcus owned the aquifer rights to the entire underground water formation, not just his spring, the source. The confrontation happened at an emergency HOA board meeting on June 22nd, called hastily after Marcus's attorney served the cease and desist order to Patricia Kendrick at her real estate office. The Meadowbrook Hills Community Center conference room was packed, the 5 board members, their attorney, and Marcus with Alina. Patricia sat at the head of the table, her expression oscillating between annoyed and dismissive. "Mr. Webb, this is highly irregular. Your accusations that Meadowbrook Hills has somehow tapped your spring are unfounded and frankly offensive. We have documentation of our water system permits." Marcus opened his folder. "Mrs. Kendrick, let me ask you something. When Meadowbrook Hills was developed 5 years ago, what water source did the permits actually approve?" The HOA attorney, a tired-looking man named Brennan, interjected. "County water connection, obviously." Marcus slid the first document across the table. "This is the original development permit application. You'll note that county water connection was approved, but the connection fee was quoted at $240,000 due to the distance from the main county line. That's about $5,400 per home for 43 residences." Patricia's face tightened. Marcus continued, his voice calm and clinical. "What's interesting is that Meadowbrook Hills never actually paid that connection fee. Instead, according to these county water records Alina subpoenaed, you've been reporting minimal water usage that doesn't match 43 occupied homes. In fact, your reported usage matches about 6 homes." He slid another document. "Because on March 8th of this year, someone hired Southwest Texas Plumbing to install what these work orders describe as auxiliary water system integration. The same company that, according to their own billing records, which Alina obtained through discovery, installed a tap junction on my property line." The color drained from Patricia's face. Board member Robert Chen leaned forward. "Wait, what are you saying? We have county water?" Marcus shook his head. "No, Mr. Chen. 6 homes on the west end of Meadowbrook have county water. Every other home in your development has been running on water stolen from my spring for the last 3 months. And according to these flow calculations," he slid a thick engineering report across the table, "you've stolen approximately 240,000 gallons of water from me. At commercial water rates, that's $17,300. The room exploded. Board members turned on Patricia, voices overlapping. Alina raised her hand for silence. "There's more. Mr. Webb has acquired the aquifer rights to the underground water formation that supplies his spring, not just his surface property, the entire aquifer. Here are the recorded deeds from 6 surrounding properties." She distributed a packet to each board member. Marcus watched their faces as they processed what they were reading. The HOA attorney, Brennan, looked like he might be sick. "You're saying Webb owns the water source underground?" Alina nodded. "Every drop, which means the illegal tap Meadowbrook Hills installed isn't just trespassing and theft. It's unauthorized extraction from privately owned underground water resources. That carries significant penalties under Texas Natural Resources Code." Patricia finally found her voice, though it came out strangled. "This is insane. You can't just buy an aquifer." Marcus leaned forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent 15 years mastering the exact laws Patricia had never bothered to understand. "Mrs. Kendrick, I'm a hydrogeologist. I've testified in 17 water rights cases. I've mapped aquifer systems for agricultural corporations with budgets larger than your entire development. My grandfather was a water engineer who specifically secured mineral and water rights to this land because he understood what you clearly don't. In Texas, water law favors whoever knows how to navigate it. You had two options when you developed Meadowbrook Hills. Pay the county connection fee and do it legally, or hire a shady plumber to tap your neighbor's spring and hope he never noticed. You chose poorly. The ultimatum came next, laid out by Alina with surgical precision. Here are your options. Option 1, continue contesting this. Mr. Webb will file a civil lawsuit for theft of natural resources. He will seek damages of $17,000 plus legal fees, plus the cost of repairing his property where you trespassed, plus punitive damages for willful resource theft. Given that Mr. Webb is an expert witness in this exact field, and given that we have documented proof of the unauthorized tap, you will lose. Spectacularly. Option 2. You immediately disconnect the illegal tap. You pay Mr. Webb $12,000 in restitution, a discount from the full damages, and you pay for proper connection to county water within 90 days. Mr. Webb will provide a professional assessment that the illegal system is fully removed, and this ends. Robert Chen spoke first, his voice tight with anger directed at Patricia. How much is the county connection going to cost us? Marcus answered quietly. Today's rates, about $300,000 split among your homeowners, about $7,000 per household, plus you'll need to pay for the internal infrastructure to connect to county main instead of my spring. Another board member, a woman named Sandra Price, put her head in her hands. $7,000. Patricia, what did you do? The HOA president's face was stone. We were trying to save money. The developer said there was a natural water source nearby that we could. Alina cut her off. You committed theft. Let's be clear about what happened here. The final exchange was brief. Patricia looked at Marcus with something between desperation and hatred. This is vindictive. You're destroying people's lives over water. Marcus's expression didn't change. Mrs. Kendrick, you stole from me for 3 months. You dismissed me when I called. You insulted my grandfather's engineering when I tried to talk reasonably. You made me document your crime at 2 in the morning with a shovel and a camera because no official would help me. You gambled that I was just a quiet neighbor who wouldn't fight back. But I'm not just a neighbor. I'm the person who owns the water you've been stealing. And yes, I spent $30,000 of my own money to purchase Aquifer rights specifically to ensure you could never do this to anyone again. That's not vindictive. That's consequence. He stood, collecting his documents. You have 72 hours to decide. After that, Alina files the lawsuit, and I shut off your water immediately under my legal rights as Aquifer owner. Choose wisely. As Marcus walked out of that conference room, he heard the shouting start behind him. And for the first time in 3 months, he smiled. The deadline came on a Thursday morning, and Marcus stood in his spring house watching the pressure gauges with Alina beside him. At precisely 8:00 a.m., he shut the main valve that fed the illegal junction line. Within his own system, water pressure began climbing immediately. By 8:15, the gauges read 14 gallons per minute, close to normal for the first time since March. Marcus's phone rang 20 minutes later. It was Robert Chen, not Patricia. Mr. Webb, the board voted. We're accepting your terms. Patricia resigned last night. We're bringing in Southwest Texas Plumbing to remove the tap today, and we've already started the process with the County Water Authority. Marcus kept his voice neutral. I'll need to inspect the removal personally, and I'll need written confirmation from the county that you've initiated proper connection. Chen's voice was tired. You'll have it. We're also paying the $12,000. Wire transfer okay. When Marcus confirmed, Chen added quietly, For what it's worth, most of us had no idea what Patricia had done. We thought we were on county water. Marcus softened slightly. I believe you, Mr. Chen, but ignorance doesn't excuse what happened. Make sure this gets fixed right. The punishment unfolded over the next 2 weeks, and Marcus documented every stage. Southwest Texas Plumbing arrived with a crew of 3, led by the same contractor who'd installed the illegal tap, a man named Dale Hoffman who looked profoundly uncomfortable when Marcus introduced himself. "You're the hydrogeologist?" Dale asked, wincing. Marcus nodded. "And you're the plumber who trespassed on my property to install an unauthorized water tap. We're going to have an interesting conversation once this is done." The crew excavated the junction, and Marcus stood over them with Alina and a video camera, recording every component as they removed it. The work was sloppy, rushed, exactly what you'd expect from someone installing something they knew was illegal. Dale's crew had to dig twice because the first excavation missed part of the outflow line. Marcus made them expand the excavation further, exposing where they damaged his original spring line during installation. "This needs repair," Marcus stated flatly. "Professional repair to my specifications at HOA expense." Dale just nodded, defeated. The complication came on day 4 of the removal when Patricia Kendrick showed up at Marcus's property line unannounced. She pulled up in a BMW, stepped out wearing sunglasses despite the overcast day, and approached where Marcus was inspecting the excavation site. "Mr. Webb, I need to talk to you." Marcus looked at her coolly. "Mrs. Kendrick, you're on my property without permission. Leave." Patricia pulled off her sunglasses, and Marcus saw genuine desperation there. "Please." "I'm begging you, the board is blaming me for everything. My reputation in this community is destroyed. People are saying I'm a criminal." Marcus crossed his arms. "You installed an illegal tap that stole 240,000 gallons of water from my property. You dismissed me when I tried to resolve this peacefully. What exactly do you want me to say?" Patricia's voice rose. "I want you to tell people this was a mistake, that it wasn't personal, that you're not pressing charges." Marcus's expression hardened. "It was personal the moment you insulted my grandfather's engineering. It became personal when you made me choose between accepting theft or fighting alone. And I'm not pressing criminal charges because the county won't prosecute property crimes like this, not because you deserve mercy. Now leave my land." But Patricia wasn't finished. "You know what? This is about ego. You're a bitter divorced man who's punishing an entire community because—" She didn't get to finish. Alina, who'd been standing nearby, stepped forward. "Mrs. Kendrick, I strongly suggest you stop talking and leave, because if you continue harassing my client, we will add a restraining order to the civil settlement. And I will personally ensure that every detail of your decision to commit water theft becomes public record in ways that extend far beyond this community." Patricia's face flushed red. She looked at Marcus one more time, found no sympathy there, and drove away in a spray of gravel. That evening, Robert Chen called Marcus again. "I apologize for Patricia showing up at your property. The board has formally expelled her, and we've hired a forensic accountant to review HOA finances. Turns out she'd been skimming money, which is probably why she was so desperate to avoid the county connection fees." Marcus absorbed this information silently. Chen continued. "The other thing is, we're discovering that 6 other families in Meadowbrook knew about the spring tap. They were bragging about free water at community events. We're considering individual assessments for those families specifically." Marcus thought about this. "That's your internal matter, Mr. Chen. My concern is that my spring is protected and properly compensated for what was taken." Chen paused. "You could have destroyed us completely, you know. You could have sued for the full amount plus punitive damages. The attorney we consulted said we'd have lost and probably faced 50,000 or more in damages." Marcus looked out his window at the spring house, at his grandfather's engineering still standing strong after 70 years. "Mr. Chen, I didn't want to destroy you. I wanted my water back, and I wanted to make sure this never happens to me or anyone else again. Justice and revenge aren't the same thing." The final inspection happened 2 weeks after the deadline. Marcus stood with Alina and a county water inspector named Tom Briggs as they examined the excavation site where the illegal tap had been. The spring line was fully repaired, pressure-tested, and restored. No trace remained of the junction that had stolen from him for months. Tom Briggs checked his clipboard. "System shows full integrity, Mr. Webb. Flow rates are back to normal." Marcus consulted his phone, which was connected to his smart monitoring system. 15.2 gallons per minute. That's actually above the historical average. Removing the restriction improved efficiency. Tom nodded. "And the county confirms that Meadowbrook Hills has initiated the connection process. They're looking at 4 to 6 months for full installation, but they're on county water at temporary rates now." Elena smiled. "Which means they're paying about triple normal rates until the permanent infrastructure is complete." Marcus didn't smile. "Which means they're paying what they should have paid 5 years ago." The reckoning came in individual pieces over the following weeks, and Marcus heard about them through Robert Chen, who'd become an unlikely ally. Patricia Kendrick had moved out of Meadowbrook Hills entirely, her reputation demolished when the financial investigation revealed she'd stolen over $15,000 from HOA funds over 3 years. The 6 families who'd known about the illegal tap were facing special assessments of $2,000 each to cover their share of Marcus's settlement, on top of the $7,000 everyone was paying for county connection. 2 of those families were selling their homes and leaving. The remaining families in Meadowbrook, the ones who'd genuinely been victims of their board's decisions, were organizing a class action suit against the developer who'd cut corners 5 years ago. And Southwest Texas Plumbing was facing sanctions from the state contractor board for performing illegal work. Dale Hoffman had provided testimony against Patricia, claiming she'd pressured him and threatened to cancel other contracts if he didn't do the tap. The truth was probably somewhere in the middle, but Marcus didn't care. The consequence was spreading the way water does, following every crack, seeping into every weakness, finding its own level. 2 months after the valve shut off, Marcus sat on his porch at sunset with his oldest horse, Ranger, grazing nearby. The spring house hummed with perfect pressure. His garden was thriving. The cattle were healthy. Everything his grandfather had built was restored and protected. Marcus held his phone, looking at a message from Alina. "Final settlement wire received. Case closed officially. Congratulations on the win." But Marcus didn't feel like he'd won anything. He felt like he'd protected something. There was a difference. He thought about Patricia's desperation, about the Meadowbrook families who'd been caught in leadership's corruption, about how systems failed until someone forced accountability. Water rights were complicated, but their fundamental principle was simple. What was yours, and taking it without permission was theft. It didn't matter if it was water or land or dignity. The law existed to protect that principle, but only for people who understood how to use it. Marcus had learned, standing in that spring house watching gauges drop to 0, that sometimes justice doesn't come from calling the right authority. Sometimes justice comes from becoming the authority yourself, from knowing more, documenting better, outmaneuvering completely. His grandfather had taught him about water, but this experience had taught him about power. And as Marcus sat there in the hill country twilight, listening to the steady flow of water that had flowed for centuries and would flow for centuries more, he understood something fundamental. He hadn't just protected his spring. He'd protected the idea that knowledge was strength, that heritage mattered, and that consequences were real for people who thought they could steal from someone they'd underestimated. The spring ran clear and strong. The aquifer belonged to him, legally and completely. And Marcus Webb smiled because justice, served hot or cold through paperwork or pressure gauges, was equally satisfying. Across the country in Portland, Oregon, retired environmental attorney Margaret Delacroix received a notice from her condo HOA demanding she remove the rooftop garden she'd maintained for 12 years. The board president, a recent transplant named Kyle, cited unapproved modifications and structural concerns. Margaret smiled, the same smile that had once preceded environmental litigation that shut down corporate polluters, and pulled out the original building plans she'd personally reviewed before purchasing the unit. Plans that explicitly designated the rooftop space as resident garden commons. Plans that she'd helped write when she'd served on the nonprofit board that converted this building. "Please," she said softly to Kyle's voicemail, "do send your structural engineer's report. I'd love to review it with the 3 structural engineers I worked with on the original renovation who'll testify that my garden actually improves drainage." Kyle went pale when he heard her credentials, but that's a story for another time.